From Lansing Community College, this is LCC Connect, and this is Lanstories, with me, David Siwik. Each episode explores a different topic, such as the people, business, neighborhoods, communities, buildings, and other phenomena that make up the history of our college and our region. We tell stories, and in doing so, we connect the past to the present.
In this episode of Lanstories, we are going to begin a two-part series looking at the history of Interstate 496, a urban freeway that goes through the heart of the city of Lansing. Although our look at 496 isn't going to be about pavement and lanes and traffic volume, instead we're looking at what happened to the neighborhood that the highway severely disrupted, actually destroyed in many ways, when that freeway was put through. And on part one of this episode, I am joined by a very special guest I'm glad to have on the program, Patrick Sambaer.
Hello.
Hello, Patrick. And Patrick worked with the Historical Society of Greater Lansing for a certain part of that project that I'll get into in a moment. But first, I'd like to provide a little bit of a background to what this project that I'm referring to was. So Interstate 496 was an urban and is an urban freeway that was put through as part of the Interstate Highway Act. The Interstate Highway Act was passed in the late 1950s when Dwight David Eisenhower was president, and it was a very long-term public works project. In fact, the interstate highways are still around, and they're still maintained with federal dollars and state dollars, and they form absolute vital part of the infrastructure of the United States. But as with any infrastructure project, people oftentimes get displaced when it involves the acquisition of and the development of substantial amounts of property. And the interstate highway system was unique because when it came to the acquisition of public and private property to put the interstates through, the reality was some of the interstate highways were put through farmland or forest that did not have people living on it at the time, but then others were put right through the hearts of American cities. And the exact opposite was the case. You had very many people living in the path of where an interstate highway would go. And in the year 2022, there is quite a bit of discussion in many cities around the United States as to what to do with the urban freeways that were put through in the middle part of the last century. So, for example, recently, the city of Detroit and the Michigan Department of Transportation worked out an agreement that the little stretch of freeway that connects Jefferson Avenue to I-75 is going to be taken out. It's one of the shortest stretches of interstate freeway in the entire United States, and the whole purpose of that freeway was to connect a major corridor in downtown Detroit to I-75, which runs right through the eastern part of the city of Detroit. But here in Lansing, I-496 has undergone an entire rebuild over the last 3 years. In 2020, the stretch that runs between just to the west of the city of Lansing, right through to where the freeway merges into I-69, was completely rebuilt. And this year, the other end of the freeway is being rebuilt, the stretch that runs from that western border of the city of Lansing right through to East Lansing. So over the past 3 years, therefore, that freeway would have been almost entirely rebuilt. And that means it's going to be here for a while. Now, the Historical Society of Greater Lansing worked with the city of Lansing to obtain grant money through the National Endowment for the Humanities to work on a history project that tells the story of the construction of Interstate 496. But, as I mentioned a moment ago, the history project was not to look at the concrete and exit ramps and on-ramps and traffic volumes and lanes and all the stuff that goes into engineering a freeway, although it looked at a little bit of that as well. The primary purpose of this project was to look at what happened to that neighborhood. What happened to the people, therefore, that lived where Interstate 496 runs. And the project was called Paving the Way, I-496. And it is a very unique and special project that involved, by the time we've gotten now about 3 years into the project, interviews of many of the people who lived in the neighborhood that was displaced by Interstate 496, and the compilation of an incredible amount of historical artifacts, including many photos of the streetscapes, the houses, and the businesses that were displaced or torn down entirely when that freeway was put through. And one of the things I've always found a little bit ironic about the name of that freeway, it's called the Olds Freeway. And those of you who live in the Lansing area and know a little bit about the history of our community know that Ransom Eli Olds, his property itself, the house that he had built, is a very famous house. It was one of the Darius Moon designed mansions in this community. It was ultimately demolished when the freeway was put through. So I am going to bring Patrick into our conversation now. And Patrick, I want you to tell us a little bit about how you became involved in the Paving the Way project.
Basically, it was my junior year of college at University of Michigan Flint, and I was looking for any kind of internship work or anything that I could do to do a little bit of the work of history. And so I was chatting with David, I believe it was over email, and I inquired with him about that, and he said, I know that my friend Bill Castanier with the Lansing Historical Society, that he's looking for someone to help him out with the interviews. And I said I'd be glad to do that.
Sure, and very glad that you took me and him, that would be Bill Castanier of the Historical Society of Greater Lansing, up on the offer. And as a programming note, I will have Bill Castanier on the next episode of Lanstories, which will be part 2 of this series on the Paving the Way I-496 project. So that's how you got involved in this project, Patrick. And tell me a little bit about the work you did first as an intern for the Historical Society of Greater Lansing, and then we'll get into some of the stories that you were a part of recording into history and what your activity with that looked like.
Oh, you make it sound like a very noble endeavor on my part. It was not very much of that. It was pretty simple. Actually, by the time I joined the project, all of the interviews and the work had basically been done, and so it was all uploaded onto YouTube. There were a couple, about 100 videos, and I just helped out with the subtitles, basically, for probably about maybe a dozen of them.
Okay. So the interviews then were recorded on video and then put on a YouTube channel, correct?
That's right, yep.
And was this a separate YouTube channel that was set aside solely for this purpose, or is it part of a YouTube channel that the Historical Society has set up and they're able to have other videos that are related to their work?
It's its own YouTube channel. It's basically just called the I-496 Pave the Way.
Okay, cool. So I have to ask you, as questions pop in my mind, which is what tends to happen in a discussion like this involving two historians, what struck you about the, let's just say the experience, as much as you could glean from it, in watching those interviews and transcribing them, the experience of the people who lived through this incredibly disruptive, and that almost sounds like a term that really diminishes the extent at which this would have impacted their life, but let's just say living through the experience is something that would have a permanent change on their lives. What was there something that seemed like a common theme, I guess is what I'm getting at, for the people that were interviewed when they were discussing this experience?
Basically, I think you can imagine kind of the first emotional reaction that someone might have when they hear about a highway being put up or any kind of large project that as a necessity has to get rid of people's homes and businesses. And you'll find that in some cases that was the case, but there were also a lot of positives that were the result of the freeway coming up and the neighborhood and Black residents moving out into other parts of Lansing.
Sure, and we'll get into that in a moment. And it's important to reiterate or expand upon a little bit that last point you make. The neighborhood that Interstate 496 was put through was a predominantly Black neighborhood, especially where 496 is now more or less between Washington and to the west, right through to where the old Lansing Road exit is now. So that there isn't much left of that neighborhood. There are two roads that run parallel to Interstate 496. There's St. Joseph on the north side of the highway, and there's what was left of the old main street of Lansing. It was renamed Malcolm X Avenue here about 10 years ago or so. So 496 then was put right through the heart of this neighborhood that was predominantly African American And besides houses, what else was located in this neighborhood that made it such a viable community?
Well, there was, for one, the very popular Johnny's Records, which was the only jazz and blues location that catered to black residents anywhere close to Lansing, I assume.
Sure. And other businesses as well?
Also, Roy Johnson's barbershop was on the same street.
Mm-hmm.
And then I believe maybe some other churches.
Okay, sure. And there were some other retail stores there as well. And what you had in that neighborhood was a blend in the way that American cities had in neighborhoods before World War II, especially a blend of mostly locally owned retail businesses, including record stores and convenience stores and small grocery stores, service businesses such as barbershops. And then the neighborhood also, of course, had schools in it. So there were neighborhood schools there that would also, be demolished when the freeway was put through. And the background behind the construction of urban freeways in the United States is a very complicated one. And I had mentioned at the beginning of our episode that in some cities around the United States, there's a reevaluation going on right now of what that landscape that the freeways created looked like before and after. And that evaluation in many cities, and I use the taking out of I-375 freeway in downtown Detroit as an example, sometimes entails people taking a step back and figuring out with the 2020 vision of hindsight, as the old saying goes, whether or not those freeways were ultimately a good thing, or if there might be some reconsideration. Were in your interviews, and the interviews you looked at, I should say, that were conducted as part of the Paving the Way I-496 project, did you encounter people having their own thoughts, that retrospective look back at the broader issues that the construction of I-496 centered around?
Well, it has to be said that the majority black makeup of the neighborhood was due to racist practices of redlining, in which the real estate brokers and other mortgage agents guided residents to the area and wouldn't let them live basically anywhere else. And so the construction of the freeway and the eventual move out of the residents into other areas of Lansing was a way to diversify the whole community.
Sure. And it absolutely had that consequence to it when you look at where the people who were displaced out of that neighborhood ended up moving to. And you bring up something else that was quite prominent for a very long time in the United States as cities develop, in this term redlining. So explain that a little bit more if you can for us.
Well, if you were to imagine a red line drawn on a map, that would basically be if you were black, you had to live within it, and if you were white, you couldn't. So
sure,
it's a way of segregating the city.
Yeah, and the red lines, as they literally appeared on maps, were typically drawn up by either real estate companies, real estate agents, or sometimes even by city officials, by urban planners. And the United States in the 2 decades after the Second World War is in a very interesting position because you have a sort of 3 or 4 major phenomena going on. You have an incredible amount of economic growth, and that economic growth came from a variety of factors, including the pent-up demand for consumer goods that built during World War II when the economy had been converted over entirely to war goods production. People couldn't go out and buy things like cars and washing machines and all the other consumer goods that were available had they been able to purchase them. And so when the war comes to an end and wartime production is converted back over to civilian production, you have this really unique circumstance in the history of industrial capitalism in the United States of an incredible amount of consumer demand. The second phenomenon is also related to the first phenomenon, and that is population growth. So the generation of Americans that were born between 1946 and 1964, the baby boomers. And the name comes from the great baby boom that people went through as the soldiers returned from the Second World War, soldiers and sailors, and started families. So the big boom of births, and then the generation that bears the name from that, the baby boomers, it's another phenomenon that's really dramatically transforming American society. And it's tied very closely to population or to economic growth, because population growth oftentimes equals economic growth. And then that leads to the third phenomenon that is going through American cities at this time, and that is a tremendous transformation in housing. Housing writ large, meaning housing in terms of what kind of houses people live in, housing in terms of where people are living, and houses in terms of what happens to the existing neighborhoods in American cities. And that lends us to the fourth phenomenon that is going on at this time period, and that is the leaving of American inner city neighborhoods by many of the more affluent residents and moving out into the suburbs. So you have this dynamic of these four major factors going on, and then the Interstate Highway Act is passed. And that equals lots and lots of money from the federal government to construct freeways, many of which will end up going through urban areas, such as the downtowns of American cities or right on the edges of downtown, such as 496. So all these factors combine to make the placement of freeways a very political, as much as an economic, or let's just say a public works decision. And when urban planners in cities worked with the federal and the state officials to lay out where the urban freeways were going to go, oftentimes the neighborhoods that those freeways were put through were purposefully selected because of who lived there. And the who that I'm referring to would be, for example, black neighborhoods, and also neighborhoods that were deemed by the local municipalities to have lower property values, which were, at the time, oftentimes, though not always, disproportionately minority or black neighborhoods. And so this brings us to eminent domain, which is the law statute and the law theory that's used for a public entity to acquire private property for the purposes of constructing a public works. In this case, the public works is the freeway. Now, oftentimes in American cities, therefore, when urban freeway projects were planned, they disproportionately impacted minority communities and African American communities in particular, especially in cities like Lansing, where after the Second World War, you have a continuation of this massive migration north into cities that had started actually going back decades before the Second World War, which is what brings a major demographic change to cities such as Lansing. So if you looked at Lansing in the year 1910, for example, it would have very few African American residents living in it. By the time you get to 1940, that quotient has changed. There are now many African American residents living in the city. And after the Second World War, that migration north out of the South of African Americans looking for work in places like the automobile factories, for example, in Lansing, continues. So that neighborhood then that Interstate 496 is put through is a neighborhood that by the time you get to the construction of the freeway has existed for a long time and has multiple generations of families living there. In the interviews that you were able to look through in doing the transcription, were you able to tease out of those interviews a sense of this multi-generational aspect of the neighborhood and what that meant to the people who lived there that would have their homes displaced because of the freeway?
So there were positives in that when the freeway went up, black residents were able to move into other parts of the city, but a negative aspect of that, which I definitely got the sense of during the interviews, which was that when they did spread out, there were fewer tight-knit communities and less of a sense of you knew everybody on the block, in which was the case before.
And I'm sure that was something that never left the minds of the individuals who went through that experience, meaning even now, decades after the freeway was built and their homes were displaced, this is something they're still able to vividly recall and remember what that felt like at the time.
Mm-hmm. And I think they would probably tell you that it was a definite change, but that there were positives and negatives to both sides of that.
Sure. And I, about probably, I want to say maybe it was 3 or 4 months ago, I engaged in a conversation on one of the social media platforms actually about this very thing. It was with, the conversation was with people who have lived in the Lansing community for a long time and are knowledgeable on the history of the construction of the freeway. And our conversation through the various messaging platforms that one can include into a social media form centered around whether or not people thought the freeway was a good idea. And my observation as a historian is that at the time, 1950s, 1960s America, people looked at urban freeways as progress. The United States had made the decision, whether people realized it at the time or not, and I think many people did, it was hard not to, that America's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, was going to be built around the automobile when it came to devices that moved on the ground, and then, of course, air transportation as well. And that the jet age, so to speak, is really one that starts in the late 1950s and into the early 60s when you have commercial aircraft that are now jets entering into service. So the train was gone and the automobile was here when it came to surface transportation improvements. And so when you look at a city like Lansing that's developing, people looked at the construction of an urban freeway as progress. Look at us. We've made it big. We have an urban freeway that will go right through downtown, and you can zip across one end of town to the other in about a matter of 10 minutes. So I've heard you mention a few times in my questioning about what the sense that you got from looking through these interviews was of the people, what they thought of the construction project. And did this ever come up in these interviews? I'm curious as to whether or not there's this idea that with the freeway being built, progress is moving forward.
Definitely. Even I would say that in the minds of these people up until the present day, I can hardly remember where I heard about them talk about the freeway itself negatively.
Okay, sure. And I always wonder, and this is just me kind of thinking.
Actually, I'd like to amend that statement.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
One lady did say that she didn't drive on the freeway because she thought it was too dangerous.
Okay. Yep. There you go. And, it makes me think of, and what I was going to say is, I always wonder that in a city like Lansing, which has had a long history of automobile production, and of course, the Olds Freeway is named after Ransom Eli Olds, who still has things in this city named after him. And Olds founded 2 automobile companies, one of which was very quickly bought by General Motors, quickly meaning shortly after it was founded, and it became the Oldsmobile brand, headquartered right here in Lansing, Michigan, until General Motors discontinued the brand in the early part of the century. And then GM would go on to have a long presence here in Lansing. Of course, GM still has a very significant presence here in Lansing with the Gren River Assembly Plant right downtown, right off the freeway. Actually, the main entrance is just maybe 30 or 40 feet from the berm.
A couple different people that were interviewed had jobs at GM.
Sure. And then the Delta Township plant, of course, which was built at about the same time. So I've always wondered if in a place like Lansing, Michigan, the construction of the freeway has more of a view of being an example of local progress or local prosperity than maybe if a freeway was put through a city of the size of Lansing that didn't have automobile production in it. And I'll ask you your thoughts on that, Patrick, and not exclusively even to the sense you got from the interviews, but just your thoughts on it as a student of history. And what do you think about that?
About freeways in general?
Yeah, freeways in general, and in Michigan in particular, where urban freeways are going through cities that have automobile production in it. I guess what I'm getting at is, do you think that in some way makes people more likely, more inclined to view those freeways as a net positive as opposed to a net negative?
In Lansing, sure, because of our, I don't want to say obsession, but fascination with automobiles.
Sure. And fascination, I think, is a good term. And how can we not be fascinated with them? Because the building of cars has been such an important part of many people's lives in this community.
Although I will add generally that if I were to hear a negative about freeways, it's that kind of the use of freeways and maybe highways in general kind of lead to a auto-centric lifestyle in which you can't really expect to get around without one now. There are not too many walkable places where you can buy groceries or visit local businesses. And during previous to the construction of the freeway, that was definitely the case.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially when we were talking about the neighborhood businesses that were located where I-496 ended up going through. And this is a similar experience, connecting Lansing here to other communities in Michigan. A similar experience to what happened in Flint, what happened in Grand Rapids, what happened in Saginaw, what happened in Detroit. All the places in Michigan that ended up having stretches of urban freeway go through them. And Detroit was sort of the greatest example of them all, because the stretch of I-75 that was laid through the eastern part of the city ended up demolishing the heart of the black business corridor in Detroit, Hastings Street. But here in Lansing, the same thing happened with 496 going through and demolishing the heart of one of the most important black neighborhoods in the city. And American cities took on a character very unique to other cities in the developed world after World War II, very much because of the construction of freeways. In other parts of the world, it is not as common to have access-controlled freeways going through right through the middle of city centers. And I just think of, for example, a city like London, which is the size of New York City. And London does not have one freeway that goes into the heart of what we would call downtown in the United States. And New York City, of course, has many freeways that take you from the boroughs of the part of the metropolitan region, including New Jersey, that will take you right into the center of New York City. And when those freeways were constructed, they had a similarly disruptive effect for the people that live in the neighborhoods as 496 did here on a smaller scale. So the freeway is such an important part of post-war America, right up there with some of the other stuff that we've been able to talk about here today. Any lasting thoughts you want to share with us? Our time's almost up, but anything else that's struck out that I haven't been able to tease out of you in my questioning so far in this episode that you were able to notice in looking through those interviews?
Well, firstly, I want to say that when the offers were made to buy the houses, the feeling at the time was that they were being undervalued. And that's when the community leaders like Rudy Wilson, who I believe was the chapter president of the NAACP, him and some others actually went door to door and handed out pamphlets and talked to people, telling them, don't accept the first offer on your house until you talk to someone else. Mm-hmm. And so after the fact, there was then the sense that they kind of got a pretty good deal out of it.
Okay. Yeah. And that's something that actually it's a good thing to leave off our part one of the episode on, because we'll pick that up on part two of the episode, or part two of the series, I should say, of episodes here on Lanstories, where we look at the construction of Interstate 496, Lansing, Michigan's urban freeway, and in particular looking at the work of the Paving the Way Interstate 496 project. Patrick, I want to thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
And everyone, we will pick this up on the next episode of Lanstories.
You've been listening to Lanstories with me, David Siwik. For more information on this program and to stream past episodes, visit lccconnect.org. LCC Connect is the official home of the voices, vibes, and vision of Lansing Community College, offering hours of original and exciting programming. Hosted by faculty, staff, and community members, LCC Connect explores our college's work in the community, important topics in higher education, and our vision for the future. Catch the vibe on 89.7 FM or online at lccconnect.org. Until next time, remember, keep telling good stories.